Variety refers to the various ways through which artists add complexity to their artwork in order to create interest. Difference or change creates dynamic compositions and can be achieved by repeating the same element or elements while changing their shapes, colors, or texture. Vasily Kandinsky's Sketch for Several Circles, 1939, is a good example of variety through change. Kandinsky uses only one kind of shape, the circle. By repeating this shape but changing its size every time and adding different colors, the artist efficiently adds variety to this artwork. The Terracotta Army is a good example of variety through difference or change. Created during the Qin dynasty, around 246 to 210 BC, the Terracotta Army totals about 8,000 life-sized human and animal figures. Although the human figures look alike, their faces are all different from each other, thus creating interest. Composed of 144 plates of titanium arranged together directly on the floor, without any kind of fixture, Carl Andre's 144 Titanium Square, 2011, could be a particularly boring piece of sculpture. The metal brushing, however, creates an opaque and uniform finish that reflects the light differently from plate to plate. This also allows for a good amount of different combinations depending on how each plate is arranged. The surface quality of each plate creates change and variety, if only this much, in an otherwise dull and repetitive piece of art. Variety can also be achieved through contrast of tone, size, color, shape, and texture. Elaboration is an additional way that artists use to achieve variety by adding detail to shapes or forms. Joseph Ulbricht's The Secession Building, an architectural manifesto for the Vienna Secession, is a great example of variety through elaboration of shapes. There is also contrast between the simple geometric forms typical of the emerging modernist movement and the ornamental, nature-inspired shapes of Art Nouveau. Balance refers to how artists arrange the various elements in a composition. It can be achieved through the use of symmetry, or otherwise negated through the use of asymmetry. Robert Morris's Untitled, 1969, is a good example of symmetry. If you pass an imaginary line through the very center of this sculpture, notice how the left and right sides are arranged in a pretty similar way. Because of that, the form on each side can be said to offset each other, making for a balanced sculpture. Robert Morris's Untitled, 1967-68, on the other hand, is a good example of imbalance, which is brought about by a symmetry of forms. There is no side equal or similar to another, and compared with the first sculpture, this one is almost disgruntled. Here's another example of symmetry, more specifically radial symmetry, in this oil on canvas by Edvard Munch, titled The Sun, 1911-16. Again, if we pass an imaginary line through the very center of this painting, shapes left and right of the central axis offset each other, creating a sense of balance. Radial symmetry usually has the effect of guiding the eyes to a central point, too. In this painting, Munch puts emphasis on the subject at the very center, and the title leaves nothing to chance. He wants us to pay attention to the sun and the light that radiates from it. We will talk about emphasis, another principle of art, in a while. The balance or imbalance of a given composition depends on the different weights given to the various elements of an artwork, their shape and color, their size, quantity, and texture, but also their position relative to each other, and the image's edge. Usually, the brighter, bigger, and more complex, or more detailed, the heavier the element tends to be. Gustav Klimt's Avenue in Schloss Kammer Park, 1912, is another good example of emphasis as well as imbalance. The emphasis given to the house in the bottom right is due to being positioned off-center, right in the vanishing point. It helps that a road literally leads our eyes to it. Secondly, the shapes of the trees and branches take the most area and are quite detailed, but they are too undifferentiated, almost shapeless and disgruntled, thus menacing and off-putting. Thirdly, the trees and branches have a green palette, which helps emphasize the sole element with a different color, the yellow house. Positioned in the background, the yellow house is the main point of interest. However, the uneasiness that we get from the whole composition is the end goal of this painting. The overall imbalance in this painting helps reinforce an ominous feeling as our eyes wander through the gloomy path that leads to the yellow house. Richard Serra's Between the Torus and the Sphere, 2003 to 2005, is yet another example of imbalance, real and implied. Made of thick metal plates that sit on their own, Between the Torus and the Sphere is unnerving. It is impossible not to get a sense of impending catastrophe just by looking at an image of this sculpture. Even more so if you were standing in the same room, you wouldn't want to step close to it. Artists use emphasis to create focal points of interest. They do that in order to draw the viewer's attention to certain parts of an artwork. This can be achieved through contrasting colors or tonal values, for instance. Pablo Picasso's The Old Guitarist, 1903-04, uses contrasting colors to add emphasis to the guitar. Notice that everything has a blue color with unassuming tones except for the musical instrument, which is brownish. Emphasis can also be achieved through placement in a central position of the artwork, or by isolating any given element in a composition. Amedeo Modigliani's Girl in a Sailor's Blouse, 1918, places the figure at the center of the composition. The artist also uses contrasting colors in order to give emphasis to the young woman's face and neck. Emphasis can also be achieved through convergence. This can be done through the use of converging lines, linear perspective, or lines of force. Frida Kahlo's Self-Portrait in Medallion, 1948, uses converging lines and radial symmetry to give emphasis to her face. Which other techniques does Kahlo employ here? Can you list them? Well, first of all, she positioned her face at the very center. In addition, notice how Kahlo used detail to represent the texture of the fabric in the ruff and robe. The motifs in the ruff and robe are repetitive, and the fabric has a dull color. In contrast, her face is smooth, has a vibrant color, and if this was not enough, it is framed by a purple headscarf. Guido Reni's The Adoration of the Shepherds, 1640, is a great example of how using converging eye lines can be effective at drawing the viewer's attention to a particular element. In The Adoration of the Shepherds, all figures except one are looking at baby Jesus. Our eyes meander from top to bottom, following the converging eye lines, jumping from one figure's face to the other. The contrasting tones help reinforce the emphasis given to the two main groups, the one at the top and the one at the bottom half. Emphasis can finally be achieved by the use of unusual scales. Always relative to humans, scale is used by artists to create visual impact either through monumental, massive scale or through skill in detailed miniature artworks. Hummingbird, Peru, circa 500 BC, 500 AD, is a Nazca geoglyph that is over 300 feet in length. It is so big that the shapes can only be seen from the sky. Adam Dirk's Prayer Nut with the Nativity and the Adoration of the Magi, circa 1500 to 1530, is an example of an artwork that impacts the viewer through the miniature scale of the carved figures. Proportion refers to the relationships between parts of subjects and between different subjects in an artwork. These proportions will command how realistic or unrealistic a representation of buildings, animals, human figures is. Contrasting and disproportionate scales between elements in the same artwork can be used for all sorts of effects, including emphasis. Claes Oldenburg and Koosje van Bruggen's Shuttlecocks, 1994, is one good instance of emphasis through the use of disproportionate scale. During the Romantic period, artists often used contrasting scales to convey the aesthetic experience of the sublime, or the sense that something is too vast, powerful, and overwhelming. Joseph Turner's Snowstorm, 1842, is a good example of how the use of contrasting scales can help convey the sense of how vast and powerful nature is and our place in it. Caspar David Friedrich's Monk by the Sea, circa 1809, follows the same principle as Joseph Turner's Snowstorm, a human figure so small that almost disappears against a vast and ominous landscape. Walter de Maria's The Lightning Field, 1977, is a more recent example of an artwork that attempts to harness nature itself to convey the aesthetic experience of the sublime. The Lightning Field is a large piece of land art located in a remote area of the high desert of western New Mexico. It comprises 400 polished stainless steel poles, 20 feet tall, and spaced 220 feet apart. We do not need an actual lightning storm to experience the scale of the artwork nor to imagine the overwhelming forces of nature.